Okay everybody, so this is the week 2 update on the Ecosphere experiment, and so far things are going really well. Algae is beginning to grow onto glasses in at least 2 or 3 jars, and organisms have been making a comeback in some of the jars. And of course the sand jar has seen a population decrease, which is also pretty good. So first we're going to start off with the lake ecosystem jar, so I'm going to quickly zoom in on it. And as you can see, this mess of algae is still floating, and I learned why it floats now. It's through a process called pearling. What happens is like oxygen bubbles form in the algae, causing the algae to rise. So that is why it's going to the surface over here. And I have some sad news and some good news. So the sad news is at least 3 or 4 of the copepod species have went extinct, and same with the ostracod species. They're kind of gone now for sure. But the other copepod species have been doing better. So I believe that's because they're more fit than the other species. The hydra, the flatworms, the diving beetle, and of course, the water skimmer made sure that the less fit organisms have died out. And what you see over here swimming really fast is the water mite. He also helped make sure that the population of the copepods went down as well. So as you can see, algae is beginning to grow into glass. It's starting to do pretty well. And over here in the soil, we're starting to get some grass or other plants to grow. I'm not sure if you could see it, but all the way back there, you see that tiny little green leaf? That is a plant growing, which is really cool. Because I didn't think I got any seeds in this water, but I got one seed apparently, and he's growing pretty fast. The flatworm population has, I guess you could say, it stayed the same. I thought it was going to grow a bit more since there was a lot of copepods, but it seems like the population has reached a plateau. So there's around 10 flatworms in this jar, and there doesn't seem to be any more. The parasitic worm has disappeared. I don't know where it went. I think it's somewhere in this mess of algae over here. And the water skimmer is still there. And the mosquitoes in the jar have decreased in number, but there is still 1 or 2 left. So let's see if we can find any. Nah, it doesn't seem like it. So this jar is doing extremely well. The algae is growing on the glass. The population of the copepods have been actually increasing. Sure, some species did go extinct, but that was to be expected. So now, I believe that this jar is going to thrive. It's finding an equilibrium, which is pretty cool. And that's what you really want in these kind of experiments. Now, moving on to the second jar. As you can see, the algae is really starting to grow on the glass. That brown stuff over there is a kind of algae. And as you can see, the copepod and ostracod population have decreased big time. And that is because of water mites. There's a lot of water mites in this jar. You can still see them on the surface over there, clinging in clusters. But they move from time to time, and whenever they move, for some reason, the water mites seem to feast on them. You see these tiny copepods here chilling around. They're gathering in, I guess you can say, a bundle over here. And they're doing pretty good. There was a parasitic worm I found in this jar, which is also quite scary, so this is why you don't swim in lakes, guys. There's a lot of parasites, and they can cause a lot of scary diseases. And as you can see, some of the copepods and other ostracod and other organisms are dying and making this kind of, I guess you could say, substrate layer on top of the sand. And that is really good because that's what we call ecological succession, and that's what we want. We want this to be a bioactive tank, so when the organisms die, they go to the bottom of the tank and they kind of fertilize this algae over here and allow it to grow. So that's why this jar is doing pretty good as well. And I'm really enjoying this jar because I thought that the population was getting too big and I knew it wasn't sustainable. So I'm extremely glad that they managed to, I guess you could say, get their act together and the population went down. It got down to a sustainable level now, and I do believe this jar will last for a long time. I think maybe a year or 2 because of how well the population control is in this jar. And hopefully all these jars can live longer than a year. I think this jar and the lake ecosystem jar can live indefinitely and maybe even forever unless these ecosystems experience quite a bit, I guess you could say a big shock like a heat wave or something, or a cool temperatures that are going to kill a huge majority of the population here. Now moving on to the next jar. As you can see, this jar is doing really well as well. So when we look at the bottom, you see a lot of copepods and ostracods hiding underneath these rocks. And this behavior is only seen in this jar, as you guys know. And their population has actually boomed to the point where some of them are starting to go to the surface now. And that's really cool. The snail, of course, is breeding like crazy. He laid 3 more egg sacs, and I've been seeing a lot more tiny snails here. Now, the snail population in this jar is getting too big and it's not sustainable, but for some reason it's not slowing down, so I guess it's going to continue to grow. As you can see, the algae in this jar kind of floats in the middle, so it's kind of on top, kind of on the bottom. It's a mix between the algae in the first jar, the lake ecosystem jar, and the sand jar. It occupies the middle space. So it's not purling as much as the lake ecosystem jar one did, but it's still in the middle of the jar, which is quite interesting. So it floats, but it doesn't float as well as the lake ecosystem jar. And finally, moving on to the last ecosphere. So now you see the control one. And as you can see, if I can focus it, the glare for some reason is really bad. Not much life in here. But don't worry. To my surprise, there was a parasitic worm in here, meaning that some life is doing pretty good, and there's 1 or 2 snails. The copepods and ostracods, let's see if we can find any. There's one. He's doing pretty good. The ones that have survived are breeding. Not well, but they are breeding. We went from 4 to 6 to maybe even about 10 now. So we'll see if this population is sustainable. I do not believe the copepod ostracod population is sustainable, but it might be. Who knows? Maybe you need just 10 individuals to get a population to start a colony to grow. But yeah, as you can see, these, I guess you could say, organisms aren't doing that great in this jar because I believe there's no substrate. And even the algae here is not doing well. As you can see, the other jars had green algae, but this algae has turned pretty white, and all the initial organisms from the first day have died and now kind of collected on the bottom. And yes, you can see 1 or 2 copepods coming out from the bottom of the tank, which is quite interesting. They're laying their eggs over their dead bodies. I don't know why. It's kind of a creepy behavior, but that's what happened. So now let's look at all 4 of the jars and discuss what is going to happen later on. So I believe that the clear jar, of course, is going to die because, well, no substrate. And I'm not sure how any organism has lasted this long in that jar. For the first 3 jars, I think ecological succession is occurring in those jars, which is very exciting. This means that an ecosystem is forming. The organisms in these jars are finding the right balance. And sure, some organisms will go extinct. The less fit ones always die. But as an ecosystem develops, there's a balance between predator and prey species. And once that balance is found, then there's harmony in that ecosystem. And sure, there will be fluctuation in prey population and predator population, but none of those species will go extinct. And that is where we're heading. The lake ecosystem jar is, I think, the closest to, I guess you could say, equilibrium, because the predator species population actually has decreased, and the prey population, the copepods and ostracods, have increased. So even though that a couple, I guess you could say, ostracods and copepod species, at least 4 or 5 went extinct in that jar, they are doing extremely well, these species that have survived. And that goes with the sand ecosystem jar and, of course, the pond rock ecosystem jar. Some species have went extinct, and I think for the sand ecosystem jar, 3 species of copepods have went extinct. And for the pond ecosystem jar, it's really hard to tell what has went extinct, but I only see about 2 species of copepods in that jar. So maybe there's more hiding under the rocks, but I think the rest have went extinct. And that's due to hydra, flatworms, diving beetles, water skimmers, water mites, and parasitic worms that are found in these jars. And that is quite fascinating. So in the next week update, we'll see if the algae actually covers the whole jar and whether or not these organisms will survive the next week. Because I'm wondering that how long this clear control jar is going to last, because this clear control jar is somehow thriving and actually increasing in population without any substrate layer. And that doesn't really make sense to me because the algae has died. So how are copepods even living in this environment? The environment is probably experiencing a huge CO2 boom because of all the copepods that have died. a big spike in the CO2 in the jar, and there's no producer in the jar to consume that CO2 and produce oxygen. So how anything is alive in that jar, I don't know. The other 2 jars, or 3 jars, are experiencing something that I find quite interesting. So I collected the same species of algae, but as you can see, there are 3 different colors. The lake ecosystem jar over here is like a lime green color algae, which is quite interesting, and it floats near the top of the jar. Then over here in the sand ecosystem jar, the algae I collected stayed a dark green color and is thriving as well, but it's not experiencing the pearling effect that the lake ecosystem jar had, and it's not floating on top. And then finally over here in the pond rock jar, the algae is staying in the middle of the jar, but it's not that dark of a color. It's like I guess you can say it's like a leaf green color, I guess. So there's a dark green in the middle jar, a leaf green color for the pond rock jar, and there's like a yellowish green for the lake ecosystem jar. And these are the same species of algae. So I believe that the different substrates in the different environments have caused the algae to become different colors, because they all experience the same amount of sunlight, so there's no other reason for why these algae should have different colors since they're the same species. I find it quite fascinating that these environments in these jars are quite different, that the algae is responding in different ways. So I'm believing that the sand ecosystem jar, since it had aquarium fertilizer, is darker green in color because it's doing a lot better than the other ones. Since the fertilizer and the CO2 plus things found in the sand helped fertilize the algae and make it grow even bigger and better than the other ones. As you can see, that leaf of algae growing is quite long now. And then I believe the pond rock one did better because I'm not actually sure why. It's doing a lot better than I think the lake ecosystem jar. But the lake ecosystem jar is the one that's also thriving here, but the algae isn't as green as the other one. And sure, it's still growing, but not growing as fast as the sand ecosystem jar algae and the pond rock algae. So yeah, this has been the week 2 update on the ecosystem jars, and I hope you guys enjoyed this. But before I end this video, I had a comment saying if I took any video idea requests, and yes, I do. So if you guys have any ideas for what I should make for my videos, or what kind of videos I should make, I'm willing to listen. Just comment below and tell me what kind of videos you guys want to see. So yeah, this has been an episode of the Ecosphere experiment, and I'm going to be contemplating about the population growth in the organisms living in these jars. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.